Today we are looking at the most recent surprise edition of the raid testing of this last Wednesday. Why? Because what also came with the reset in the War Within beta were the balance tuning changes. And this was relevant because the balance tuning changes did change quite a lot of things. For example, Unholy DK was severely nerfed, Sun Lane Hero Talent Tree was nerfed, Unholy itself was nerfed in practically all of their abilities, Frost DK was buffed overall across the board. You also had some changes to Balance Druid, you also had the changes to Mage, in particular the weird ones to Arcane, the buffs to Frost and Fire Mage. You had, of course, then the introduction of the whole of the changes to Shaman. So now you get to see the first raid testing with the new versions of Resto, Enhancement and Elemental, plus some changes as well to Fury Warrior. And this comes also less than a week after the flat buffs given to some specs, like for example the 20 or 30% damage increase to Fury, to Arms, to the 3 rogue specs, to Elemental Shaman. So that is what we are focusing on today, not just the overall damage of all of the specs, but in particular the results of the specs that actually received some changes. So let's start from what is the least relevant one, which is the healer results, because the only significant change to healer was to Restoration Shaman. And if you look at the results right now, Holy Paladin, Mistweaver, Resto Shaman and Preservation Evoker were pretty much the better performing healers. This seems like a familiar set of results because it's the exact same results we just looked at a bit over a week ago, with Resto Druid, Holy Priest and Discipline being the worst ones, and then the other 4 being quite close to each other in terms of numbers. So even with the changes given to Restoration Shaman, and also even considering the set of changes still bugged, still not working for Restoration Shaman, the results are still that Resto Shaman is doing quite well. Now, the changes planned by Blizzard didn't exactly change much when it comes to the raid. The major change to the Shaman build in the raid was attempting to make Healing Surge more powerful. As you can see from the healing done in this log, there is no Healing Surge. In this log, even if it's in funny little scribbles, Healing Surge was only casted 3 times. In this one, Healing Surge was cast 1 time, so no, Healing Surge is not really being implemented by Shamans in the raid. So practically the bigger result is that your Chain Heal got slightly nerfed because you lost your Chain Heal cooldown with your Mana Tide, but you gained Damper as an actual decent ability compared to what it was before, as well as Spirit Link. Now Spirit Link together with Spouting Spirits giving you just more free healing every time you use it. And that's pretty much the only meaningful change when it comes to healers. The implemented set of changes of Resto Shaman, which also hasn't really changed their performance by much because they were already doing quite well before the changes of this last reset in the beta. So what becomes relevant now is of course the set of changes when it comes to the DPS. What makes the changes to the DPS a bit more relevant than the ones of the healers is that the 3 bosses being tested this week were quite different in their damage profile, because Sikran that was tested is pure single target. And then you have Blood Twister, which is a single target boss that spawns 4 adds, so it becomes a 5 target AoE fight for a bit. And then you have the Silken Cord, which is a 2 target cleave for most of the time. So you don't just get to see the result of the DPS, but also you get to see the result of the DPS in 3 different damage profiles, which is quite insightful. Now, what does that mean if you get to see 3 different damage profiles? And when it comes to single target, Arcane Mage is absolutely dominating. When it comes to AoE, Arcane Mage is still the dominating one in the top, and when it comes to cleave, Arcane Mage is still overall the dominating one. Well, I'm no expert, but it looks like this means Arcane is the best spec right now in the beta. This is honestly pretty funny, because we touched on this when you looked at the changes to Arcane. These started out as nerfs, because Arcane Orb got nerfed, Arcane Barrage got nerfed, Arcane Blast got nerfed, and then you got a compensation 20% damage buff to Arcane Missiles, which was even smaller than this because you lost improved Arcane Missiles as a talent, and then more talents being lost and a couple of repositioning of talents in your tree. But that is exactly what made Arcane more powerful than before. And they were already doing quite well after being buffed. And that's because previously your Siphon Storm buff to give you stacking intellect was tied behind 3 talent points of expenditure. You were forced to take Presence of Mind and then forced to take Evocation, and then you could take Siphon Storm. Now it's as easy as a single talent point, which is also guaranteed to take because it's right after Touch of the Magi. So your previous 3 talent point cooldown that you wanted has now turned into a 1 talent point cooldown, which has now freed up more points for you to spend elsewhere. Then, with the buff of Arcane Missiles and the changes, the reorganizing of talents around the tree, pushing most of your AoE talents down the right side and many powerful talents also synergizing with Arcane Missiles close together, Arcane Debilitation for stacking damage increase, extra value to consuming clear casting, which gives you even more damage to Arcane Missiles, to the point where even though this one is for AoE, you can still use this in single target because of how much more value it gives to Arcane Missiles. You have High Voltage for more charges with Arcane Missiles, and then of course Arcane Harmony. Now all of this together, the combination of the buffs to Arcane Missiles and the nerfs to the other abilities has put you into a position where now, with the further nerfs given to Arcane Blast, you have moved away from practically just chain spamming or having periods in your rotation of heavy Arcane Blast spam and ignoring most of your other abilities. Now that little bit is gone. And on top of this, you gained the free, you can say, the free value of having way more consistent burst now, thanks to, guess what this might be? You know, guess what this might be on a 1.5 minute cooldown? Well, obviously, this thing turns out to be your Evocation, which you now have gotten with a single talent point, when it previously costed 3. So, funnily enough, despite Arcane itself being nerfed overall, the talent reorganizing and repositioning around the tree, plus the buff also to Arcane Missiles, turned out to actually be a buff to Arcane, who was already doing quite well. This was the last set of damage testing in the raid, and you can see how Arcane, even in the mythic testing, was already the strongest one, and now they continue to be the strongest. The other one worth checking on though is Unholy, because Unholy and Frost DK were both changed. Unholy received a large amount of nerfs and then Frost was buffed overall. So the results after these changes tell us that they are still in the top half of the results. In AoE they are even better, and in Cleave they are even better. Basically, as long as you can start hitting more than a single target, they start doing progressively better. And the change now is that it's no longer just Unholy, but Frost DK as well. Because again, if we go back to the pre-change tests, even of Mythic, Unholy was super high up, in fact the best spec, and Frost was, you know, a honest middle of the pack. And in AoE, Frost started doing a little bit better, back to pure single target. Frost was doing worse, but after the changes they are now much more close to each other. What is also interesting is that Unholy is starting to try other avenues in doing damage, right? Unholy usually specifically just played around Sun Lane because of how powerful it was. Now more Unholy DKs are trying the Rider of the Apocalypse, you know, angle due to the nerfs given to Sun Lane, which is still playable, is still usable, just not nearly as powerful as it was before the nerfs. However, talking about the changes, there was another spec that was greatly changed in this reset, definitely the one with the most changes when it comes to DPS, which was of course Elemental. We touched on the sadness of Enhancement not really receiving much of any changes since Blizzard decided they were already doing fine. They were in an already pretty good state as per Blizzard's judgment. Now, Blizzard's judgment of Enhancement by looking at the raid testing is not exactly wrong. They are in the top half of results, receiving practically no changes, or if anything, being slightly nerfed in, you know, 1 fewer talent points to use in their talent 3. So yeah, technically they are still doing quite fine. However, who was, you know, the more changed one overall was Elemental. And in the Cleave fight of Silken Court, they are in the top 3. In pure single target, they are in top 3, and in AoE burst, AoE, they are, you know, unimpressive, but not that weak. Now, there is a pro and a con to this. The pro is that now you're strong and now you're doing much more damage than before. The con of this is that you would struggle to see this as a newly changed Elemental Shaman by looking at the damage. And if you looked at the casts, you would be like, this is Dragonflight. What is this? I can practically only tell this is the beta because I see this random Call of the Ancestors. That's not a thing in Dragonflight, but otherwise you could have probably fooled me into linking me some random, Ferak damage log of a Mirjasil. Even if we were hyped at the possibility of a refreshed rotation of elementals starting to weave in more Ice Furies together with the empowered Frost Shocks and now the Lightning Bolts to benefit from all the buffs that you could get from your talent tree, well, the result is not actually proving to be that effective as we thought. Now, you're still down whenever you have the charges for mostly just spamming Lava Burst in your windows of high damage. And, being hyped at now Ice Fury being a proc for your Frost Shock, well, most of the time Frost Shock just gets ignored whatsoever for your spam of Lava Burst because of how much more power Lava Burst has in your tree. And this is still quite visible and one of the bigger problems still of Elemental even after the changes, now that we get to see the actual numbers behind the abilities, where Lightning Bolt continues to hit like a wet noodle. It does become kind of a problem when your Lightning Bolt practically does a third of the damage of a Lava Burst, which means as long as Lava Burst is active and available, I never get to click Lightning Bolt because it does nothing for me. Add to this the fact that even though Frost Shock actually does respectable damage, it doesn't have all of the hooks of Lava Burst in your talent tree. All of the damage increases, the fire damage increases, hooks of Lava Burst in your damage tree. Let's not forget overloading, since Frost Shock cannot overload but Lava Burst can. So even making Frost Shock match the damage of Lava Burst is not really gonna work out. The only solution, I'm afraid at the moment, seems like nerfing Lava Burst by some 30% damage and buffing both Frost Shock and Lightning Bolt by 20+% to actually make them part of your rotation. Otherwise, even after this large set of changes to Elemental, they are still going to continue spamming Lava Burst as long as they have the chance. At least now they are doing so with their performance much improved compared to before. Now, as far as the other change specs, after Arcane, Elemental, I guess the no changes to enhancement, the 2 DK specs, we did have some wide sweeping flat damage increases a bit over a week ago after the last raid testing. So this one was the latest raid testing where those specs got to perform after being buffed. We had some pretty large flat 20 to 30% damage increase overall to all 3 rogue specs, to both of the warrior specs. Now, we're not getting much of this when it comes to the rogue specs across the board. The only one that is performing slightly better is Subtlety Rogue. But even then, there isn't really much to say about sub when the change was just a flat 30% something damage increase. So as far as their rotation, as far as their build, and their playstyle, nothing really has changed. It's just hitting harder. The same can be said for the warrior specs, which got a flat damage increase more than anything, who got, on top of the damage increase, some changes to their talents. So something perhaps more significant was Balance Druid. Unfortunately though, by looking at the results, Balance Druid continues to do terribly, even after the buffs. Now, Balance Druid is continuously doing terribly, also because right now they are amongst the least well-working specs right now when it comes to DPS. They are stuck playing with the Eluna's Chosen build for more arcane damage, and as a result, they are now focusing way more on Starfire casts than they are on Wrath casts, even in single target. Even when it comes to just a single target being attacked, Starfire is the choice over Wrath now, and then the rest of your build and rotation remains the same. So that's depressing. That's the TLDR of Balance Druid right now. Your hero talent is actually doing nothing other than perhaps making your build even worse. you're still, by the way, if these weren't problems enough, you're still one of the squishiest DPS specs in the game. So if you weren't only worried about your damage, you're now also worried about your survivability. So changing the value and the power of your talents, possibly making things worse by, for example, buffing Lunar Calling to make Starfire even more relevant in single target, which is not that satisfying and also doesn't really improve your rotation whatsoever. So even after the changes to balance, as long as they were mostly just numbers, tuning on your talents without actually changing the heredity of the 0 talent tree with way too many forced options and not enough variety in your build, has not really made Balanced Druid any better in this latest round of tuning. Now, to close out what jumps a little bit more to the eye, even though not being changed, we can't really go and pinpoint the problem after the tuning, since they didn't get any major changes to begin with, is Shadow Priest, which is right now one of the weakest performer across the DPS specs. They have been nerfed back to back to Void Weaver. The damage of their Void Blast was first nerfed by 25% and then Entropic Rift in this latest round of tuning was also nerfed by 25%, and their performance right now is reasonably weak in the beta when it comes to the raid performance. The other perhaps curious situation is the one regarding both of the Warlock and the Mage specs, because even though Affliction is doing slightly better than the other two specs overall, especially in larger targets, at least more than one target, and Destruction and Demo are doing worse, same goes for the mages. Even after this latest set of buffs to both Frost and Fire, Arcane perhaps is siphoning all of the good players away for the moment, leaving out even weaker performances to the other mage specs just because of how powerful Arcane is right now. And as mentioned, this was roughly why it was more relevant to check up on the changes, because 3 different bosses were being tested and they all had different damage profiles, and this was coming after a set of tuning. So it was a pretty good moment to go and check up how specs have been performing. Damage numbers right now are not that relevant. What remains more relevant is the playstyle, is how smooth the spec is to play, or also how powerful you can see currently your rotation and your cooldowns being in different damage profiles, whether it is single target, cleave, AoE, priority damage, burst damage on a single target, or in AoE. Fighting multiple types of boss fights makes this more easier to notice and to tune. So that is what was interesting to check up on in this latest round of tuning. But for today, in the middle of this weekend, on this Saturday, it's all we are going to check as far as raid results go. So we're starting our goodbyes, of course, by thanking everyone for having watched the video, as well as everyone else who is supporting for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, Yep, we are about to start a full week of 33 to 34 degrees. I am ecstatic